My youth pastor told me I was being dramatic when I showed him the video. Boys your age see things that aren't there, he said while deleting it from my phone. 2 weeks later, FBI agents were searching his house. I was 16 when I noticed Coach Sullivan spending too much time with the younger boys at our church's weekend basketball program. The program ran every Saturday morning in the church gymnasium, supposedly teaching middle school kids fundamentals while keeping them off the streets and connected to the church community. Sullivan was a volunteer who'd shown up 6 months earlier offering his services for free, and the church leadership had been thrilled to find someone willing to work with the most challenging age group. He was maybe 40 years old with this friendly dad energy that made parents trust him immediately, always arriving early to set up equipment and staying late to lock up the gym. My mom volunteered in the church office and constantly praised Sullivan for his dedication, saying the church was lucky to have found such a committed servant willing to give up his Saturdays for youth ministry without asking for any compensation or recognition. I helped with the basketball program because I needed volunteer hours for my college applications, and basketball was something I actually understood, unlike most church activities that felt foreign and awkward to me. My role was basically being Sullivan's assistant, helping run drills and keeping score during scrimmages while he focused on individual coaching. The first few weeks seemed completely normal, just standard basketball instruction with kids who had varying levels of skill and interest. Sullivan knew the game well and could break down complex plays into simple steps that even the most uncoordinated kids could follow. He had this patient teaching style where he'd demonstrate a move multiple times without getting frustrated when kids struggled to replicate it, which made him popular with students who'd felt discouraged by more demanding coaches at their schools. Parents loved him because their sons actually wanted to attend the Saturday sessions, instead of complaining about having to wake up early for church activities. About 2 months into the program, I started noticing Sullivan pulling specific kids aside for what he called specialized training sessions. He'd take them into the equipment room at the back of the gymnasium, a windowless storage space where we kept basketballs, cones, and other gear. The room was maybe 15 feet by 20 feet, with concrete walls that made sounds echo strangely, and it had one of those heavy metal doors that locked automatically when it closed. Sullivan said he was working with these kids on fundamental skills they needed before they could keep up with the group drills, which sounded reasonable enough that I didn't question it initially. The sessions would last anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, with Sullivan emerging sweaty and energized while the kid looked exhausted and quiet. He'd pat them on the back and send them to rejoin the group, usually giving them a water bottle and telling them they'd done great work that would really pay off in their game performance. The pattern of which kids got selected for these private sessions bothered me once I started paying attention to it. Sullivan always chose the smaller, quieter boys who seemed more isolated from their peers, kids who'd show up without parents staying to watch and who rarely talked during water breaks. There was this 12-year-old named Aiden who got pulled aside almost every single week, sometimes twice in one session. Aiden was small for his age with this nervous energy that made him seem younger than he actually was, and his dad dropped him off in the parking lot without ever coming inside to see what the program actually looked like. Another regular for private training was a kid named Isaiah, who'd recently moved to our town and didn't have any friends in the group yet, making him dependent on Sullivan's attention as his only social connection during the Saturday sessions. A third boy named Liam had some kind of learning disability that made team instructions challenging for him to follow, which Sullivan used as justification for why he needed separate coaching away from the main group. I mentioned my observations to my mom one Saturday afternoon after we'd finished the basketball session and were driving home. I explained that Sullivan's private training approach seemed weird to me, especially since he always took kids into a locked room where nobody could see what was happening. My mom immediately got defensive in that way parents do when you question something they've already decided is good, telling me that individualized instruction was actually best practice for helping struggling students, and I should be grateful someone cared enough to provide that level of attention. She said Sullivan was going above and beyond his volunteer responsibilities by offering private coaching, and my skepticism about his methods showed a cynical attitude that wasn't healthy for someone my age. The conversation ended with her suggesting I focus on being a better helper, instead of inventing problems where none existed, which made me feel stupid for even bringing up my concerns. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Aiden's face when he came out of the equipment room each week, this blank expression that looked like he was trying not to think about what had just happened. The next Saturday, I positioned myself near the equipment room door during one of Sullivan's private sessions with Isaiah. I couldn't hear distinct words through the heavy door, but I could hear tones and rhythms of conversation that sounded wrong for a basketball coaching situation. There were long silences followed by Sullivan's voice getting lower and more intense, then sounds that might have been crying quickly shushed. My stomach felt sick listening to those muffled sounds, knowing something bad was happening but having no proof beyond my gut feeling that this wasn't normal coaching behavior. When the door finally opened, Isaiah came out with his shirt untucked and his shoelaces undone, walking straight to the bathroom without rejoining the group. Sullivan followed a minute later looking relaxed and satisfied, immediately calling the group together for a scrimmage like nothing unusual had occurred. I caught Isaiah's eye when he came back from the bathroom and saw this haunted look that confirmed my suspicions, but I had no idea what to do with that confirmation. I decided to try documenting what I was observing, so I started keeping notes on my phone about which kids went into private sessions and for how long. Over 3 weeks, I recorded that Aiden had 6 private sessions totaling almost 3 hours, Isaiah had 4 sessions totaling about 90 minutes, and Liam had 3 sessions totaling roughly 75 minutes. No other kids were getting pulled aside, just these 3 who fit Sullivan's apparent preference for smaller, isolated, vulnerable boys. The documentation made the pattern undeniable, but I still didn't know who to tell or whether anyone would believe me. During the 4th week of my documentation, I noticed Sullivan had started locking the equipment room from the inside during sessions, which was new behavior that seemed designed to prevent interruptions. The changed protocol made my anxiety spike because it suggested escalation, like he was getting bolder about whatever he was doing behind that locked door with young boys who had no power to refuse his specialized attention. That Saturday, I waited until Sullivan took Aiden into the equipment room and locked the door. Then I quietly walked over and positioned my phone against the door crack, where I could potentially hear what was happening inside. The audio quality was terrible through the thick door, but I managed to record about 4 minutes of muffled conversation that included Sullivan's voice saying things like, "This is our special training," and "You can't tell anyone or you'll get in trouble," and "Good boy, you're doing so well for me." The phrases made my skin crawl even though I couldn't hear Aiden's responses or see what was physically happening. When I heard them moving toward the door, I quickly backed away and pretended to be organizing basketballs across the gym. Aiden emerged looking pale and shaky, heading straight for the water fountain without making eye contact with anyone. Sullivan came out adjusting his waistband and checking his phone, calling for everyone to gather for a team huddle about next week's schedule. I stood in that huddle feeling like I might throw up, knowing I'd just recorded evidence of something deeply wrong but terrified about what would happen when I tried to report it. After the session ended and parents started arriving for pickup, I approached Sullivan directly and told him I'd accidentally recorded audio from near the equipment room and heard some concerning things. I wanted to see how he'd react when confronted, whether he'd show guilt or defensiveness or try to explain away what I'd heard. His face went completely blank for a second, like he was calculating his response. Then he smiled this friendly, concerned smile and asked if we could talk privately in his office. The church had given him a small office in the youth wing for storing program materials and planning sessions, which in retrospect was insane given that he was an unsupervised volunteer with keys to multiple rooms where children gathered. We walked to his office and he closed the door behind us, his demeanor shifting from friendly to serious once we were alone. He asked to see my phone and hear what I'd recorded, so I pulled up the audio file and played it for him with my hand shaking slightly because I was suddenly alone in a closed room with someone I suspected of abusing children. Sullivan listened to the recording with no expression on his face, then reached over and took my phone from my hand before I could react. He deleted the audio file while I watched, his fingers moving quickly across my screen to also check my recently deleted folder and permanently erase it from there too. My protest died in my throat as he handed my phone back and explained in this calm voice that what I'd heard was completely innocent coaching instruction that my teenage mind had misinterpreted due to listening through a door without context. He said boys my age often see things that aren't there because we're at an age where everything seems suspicious and threatening, especially when it involves male mentorship of younger boys. The way he said it made me feel like I was the problem, like my concerns were evidence of my own twisted thinking rather than legitimate observations of his inappropriate behavior. He suggested I needed to mature and learn to trust adult authority figures instead of inventing scandals where none existed, and he expected me to keep my misguided suspicions to myself rather than spreading rumors that could damage the basketball program and hurt the kids who benefited from it. I left his office feeling shaken and confused, unsure whether I'd just been gaslit by a predator or whether I really had misinterpreted innocent coaching. The recording was gone, and I hadn't made a backup copy, which meant I had no evidence beyond my word against his. That night I barely slept, replaying the confrontation and kicking myself for being stupid enough to show him the recording instead of sending it to someone else first. My friend Marcus, who I'd known since elementary school, noticed I was acting weird at school on Monday and asked what was wrong, so I told him everything about Sullivan and the private sessions and the recording I'd lost. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression getting progressively more serious as I explained the whole situation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before telling me that his younger brother Dante was in that basketball program and had started acting strange lately, waking up from nightmares and refusing to talk about what happened at church activities. Marcus said he'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't known what, and my story about Sullivan made horrible sense of his brother's behavioral changes. We decided to talk to the school counselor together, figuring she'd have to take allegations of child abuse seriously even if church leadership might dismiss them. Mrs. Jiang's office was small and cluttered with college brochures and motivational posters, but she listened to our concerns with full attention and took detailed notes while we explained everything about Sullivan's pattern of isolating vulnerable boys. She asked whether we'd told our parents or anyone at the church, and we explained that my attempt to report to Sullivan directly had resulted in him deleting my evidence and gaslighting me about what I'd observed. Mrs. Jiang's expression hardened when I described that confrontation, and she explained that destroying evidence and manipulating a minor who was trying to report abuse were serious red flags that suggested Sullivan knew exactly what he was doing. As a mandated reporter, she had legal obligations to report suspected child abuse to authorities, even if we asked her not to. And she wanted to make sure we understood that our conversation would trigger an investigation we couldn't control once it started. Marcus and I agreed we wanted her to make the report, understanding that whatever consequences followed had to be better than staying silent while Sullivan continued accessing vulnerable boys every Saturday. Mrs. Jiang made a phone call right then to the child abuse hotline, providing them with detailed information about Sullivan's pattern of isolating specific boys for private sessions, my deleted recording, the locked equipment room, and Dante's behavioral changes that correlated with his participation in the program. The intake worker asked follow-up questions about the church name and address, Sullivan's full name if we knew it, and whether we had any information about other potential victims beyond the 3 boys I'd documented. Mrs. Jiang answered everything she could and said she had 2 students present who could provide additional details if investigators needed to interview us. After she hung up, she explained that Child Protective Services would likely contact our parents within 24 hours and that we should prepare ourselves for significant family conflict, since parents often react defensively when their trust in institutions is challenged by their children's allegations. Her warning proved accurate within hours. My mom got a call from CPS that same afternoon while I was still at school, and when she picked me up, her face was red with anger and embarrassment in equal measure. The drive home was silent except for the radio playing Christian contemporary music that felt bitterly ironic given the circumstances. And when we got inside, both my parents were waiting to confront me about why I'd gone behind their backs to report Sullivan to government authorities instead of handling concerns through proper church channels. I tried explaining that I had tried to handle it internally by talking to Sullivan himself, which had resulted in him deleting evidence and manipulating me into questioning my own observations. My dad interrupted to say I never should have recorded anything in the first place because secretly recording people without their consent was illegal in our state, which might be true, but seemed like a bizarre thing to prioritize when the content of the recording suggested child abuse. My mom added that I'd potentially destroyed a good man's reputation over misunderstood coaching techniques and teenage paranoia, and they were deeply disappointed that I'd chosen to involve secular authorities in church matters that should have been resolved internally through prayer and proper pastoral oversight. The confrontation lasted over 2 hours, with them alternating between anger at my actions and concern about how this would affect our family's standing in the church community. They'd already received calls from other parents asking what was happening with the investigation, and apparently several families were pulling their kids from the basketball program and blaming my report for ruining something that had been beneficial for their sons. Nobody seemed concerned about whether Sullivan might actually be abusing children, just about the disruption and embarrassment my allegations were causing the church community. I kept trying to redirect conversation to Dante's nightmares and behavioral changes, to Aiden's haunted expressions after private sessions, to Sullivan's deliberate isolation of vulnerable boys, and his deletion of evidence when confronted. None of those details seemed to matter to my parents as much as their perception that I'd betrayed the church by going to outside authorities instead of trusting internal leadership to handle problems appropriately. My dad finally sent me to my room, informing me I was grounded indefinitely and would not be returning to volunteer with the basketball program or participate in any other church activities until this situation was resolved and I demonstrated proper respect for authority. Being grounded felt like relief rather than punishment, since it meant I wouldn't have to face Sullivan at church or pretend everything was normal while an investigation unfolded. That night, I lay in bed feeling isolated from my family and guilty about the disruption I'd caused, even though intellectually I knew reporting suspected abuse was the right thing to do regardless of social consequences. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus saying his parents had reacted similarly, grounding him and expressing disappointment that he'd participated in making what they considered a false report about a dedicated volunteer. We messaged back and forth for an hour, both of us struggling with the gap between knowing we'd done the right thing and feeling like terrible people because every adult in our lives was telling us we'd acted inappropriately. Mrs. Jiang had warned us this would happen, but experiencing the actual backlash was worse than I'd anticipated. The isolation from community and family felt crushing, making me understand why most abuse goes unreported when victims face this level of rejection and blame for disclosing. On Wednesday, 2 CPS investigators showed up at our house requesting to interview me without my parents present. My mom tried to refuse entry, insisting she had parental rights to be present during any questioning. But the older investigator named Frank Nguyen explained politely that in cases involving institutional abuse, they often interviewed minors separately to ensure parental loyalty to the institution didn't influence testimony. My dad threatened to call our lawyer until Frank informed him that obstructing a CPS investigation was a criminal offense, and they had legal authority to conduct interviews regardless of parental objections. The tension in our living room was thick enough to feel physical as my parents reluctantly allowed the investigators inside, and I was taken to our dining room for private conversation. Frank and his colleague Jessica introduced themselves and emphasized repeatedly that I wasn't in trouble. They just needed to understand what I'd observed and why I felt concerned enough to make a report. I explained everything chronologically, starting with noticing Sullivan's pattern of isolating specific boys and continuing through my documentation, the deleted recording, and his gaslighting response when I confronted him. The investigators asked detailed questions about the physical layout of the gymnasium and equipment room, whether there were windows or cameras, how Sullivan obtained keys to locked rooms, whether I'd witnessed any physical contact beyond verbal coaching. I explained I hadn't seen anything explicitly sexual or violent, just patterns of isolation and control that felt predatory, combined with the concerning audio I'd briefly recorded before Sullivan deleted it. Jessica asked whether Sullivan had threatened me when he took my phone and erased the evidence, and I had to think carefully about how to describe that interaction, because he'd never made explicit threats, but the implicit message had been clear: stay quiet or face consequences. Frank wrote detailed notes while Jessica studied my face, evaluating whether I seemed credible or motivated by some agenda against Sullivan. After 90 minutes of questions, they thanked me for the detailed documentation I'd kept and said they'd be interviewing other families whose children participated in the basketball program, particularly parents of the 3 boys I'd identified as receiving unusual amounts of private attention. That same afternoon, detectives from the county sheriff's department showed up at Cross Point Church requesting access to the gymnasium and Sullivan's office to collect evidence related to an ongoing investigation. The church board initially refused, citing religious freedom and the autonomy of the church to manage internal affairs, but the detectives returned with warrants 2 hours later that gave them authority to search church property regardless of leadership's cooperation. They spent hours photographing the equipment room, collecting the basketballs and cones and other items Sullivan had used during private sessions, seizing his personal belongings from his office, including his computer and phone. Sullivan maintained this calm, cooperative demeanor throughout the search, telling detectives he had nothing to hide, and welcomed a thorough investigation that would clear his name from these misguided accusations. His confidence seemed to reassure church leadership and my parents that the whole situation was indeed a misunderstanding that would be quickly resolved once authorities recognized they'd wasted resources investigating innocent youth ministry activities. The basketball program was suspended indefinitely pending the investigation's outcome, with the church board citing the need for community healing and reconciliation before resuming youth athletics. Multiple families were furious about the suspension, directing their anger at Marcus and me for ruining what they considered a valuable program that had been helping troubled boys find positive mentorship. I received hostile messages on social media from other teenagers calling me a snitch and accusing me of destroying something good because I was jealous of Sullivan's attention going to younger kids instead of volunteers my age. The cyberbullying escalated quickly enough that Mrs. Jang had to involve school administration, resulting in 3 students getting suspended for harassing witnesses in an active investigation. My parents remained convinced I'd overreacted to normal coaching behavior and created this entire disaster through teenage paranoia, amplified by watching too many true crime documentaries. The divide between us felt unbridgeable because they'd invested so much trust in Sullivan and the church that admitting he might be dangerous would require acknowledging their judgment had catastrophically failed. Marcus's brother Dante started therapy the week after CPS got involved, with his parents finally taking his nightmares seriously. Once outside, authorities validated that something concerning might be happening. His therapist used play therapy techniques to help Dante feel safe discussing difficult experiences, and within 3 sessions, Dante disclosed that Sullivan had been molesting him during the private training sessions for over 2 months. The abuse had started with seemingly innocent touches that gradually escalated to explicit sexual contact, with Sullivan using religious language about special bonds and godly love to normalize the behavior and ensure Dante's silence. He'd told Dante that their private sessions were a secret blessing from God and that telling anyone would destroy this special ministry Sullivan was providing. The disclosure triggered immediate criminal investigation protocols, with forensic interviewers recording Dante's statements and medical professionals documenting physical evidence of abuse. Marcus called me after Dante's disclosure interview, his voice shaking as he described his brother's trauma and how grateful he was that we'd reported when we did, because the abuse would have continued indefinitely if we'd accepted adult dismissals of our concerns. Within a week of Dante's disclosure, 2 more boys from the basketball program came forward with similar stories of grooming and molestation during private equipment room sessions. Aiden described months of escalating abuse that had left him feeling worthless and complicit, believing Sullivan's manipulation that they shared responsibility for what was happening in those locked rooms. Liam disclosed through his special education teacher that Sullivan had used his learning disability as justification for why he needed extra help, isolating him from peers and family through careful manipulation disguised as patient mentorship. Each new disclosure revealed more about Sullivan's systematic approach to identifying vulnerable children, gaining community trust through volunteer work, isolating targets through specialized attention, and exploiting religious authority to maintain victims' silence. Detectives executed warrants for Sullivan's personal electronics and found extensive evidence including child sexual abuse material, chat logs with victims using church email accounts, and documents suggesting he'd been researching how to avoid detection while accessing children through religious organizations. Sullivan was arrested at his apartment on a Thursday morning, charged with multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault of minors, production and possession of child sexual abuse material, and using a position of trust to exploit children. The arrest made regional news with his photo displayed on every channel, described as a trusted church volunteer who'd allegedly abused multiple young boys under the guise of providing basketball coaching and Christian mentorship. The story spread rapidly through social media, with former members of basketball programs at previous churches coming forward to report similar experiences with Sullivan from years earlier. Investigation revealed he'd left at least 4 previous churches under suspicious circumstances that had been quietly managed to avoid scandal, with leadership prioritizing institutional reputation over victims' safety and justice. If any of those previous incidents had been properly reported and investigated, Sullivan never would have been allowed near children at our church, and the boys he abused might have been spared that trauma. That knowledge filled me with rage at systems that protect predators through silence and reputation management. My parents finally acknowledged they'd been wrong about Sullivan after his arrest, and the overwhelming evidence became public through media coverage and formal charges. They apologized for dismissing my concerns and for punishing me when I'd been trying to protect vulnerable children from someone dangerous. Their apology felt hollow because it only came after external validation through law enforcement and media, rather than trusting their own son's observations and instincts. I accepted the apology because refusing it would have made home life unbearable. But something fundamental had broken in our relationship that couldn't be repaired through retroactive recognition that I'd been right. They'd chosen loyalty to church community over believing their child, and I'd never forget that betrayal even if they eventually changed their minds. Marcus reported similar dynamics with his parents, who apologized to him while simultaneously minimizing how much their initial rejection of his concerns had hurt and damaged his trust in them as protectors. The church community fractured catastrophically in the aftermath of Sullivan's arrest and charges. Approximately half the congregation left Crosspoint entirely, unable to reconcile their trust in leadership with such a profound failure of child safeguarding. The remaining members split between those acknowledging systemic problems and advocating reform versus those insisting Sullivan was an isolated predator who'd fooled everyone despite red flags. The senior pastor resigned under pressure after emails emerged showing he'd been informed 2 years earlier about Sullivan's concerning behavior, but had dismissed the report without investigation. Associate pastors who'd vouched for Sullivan's character and celebrated his volunteer commitment issued public apologies that felt insufficient, given the magnitude of their failure. The entire church board was replaced after independent review revealed they'd never conducted proper background checks or reference verification for volunteers working with minors, operating on presumed trustworthiness rather than actual screening protocols. Dante, Aiden, Liam, and the other victims began trauma therapy to process their abuse and the systemic betrayal that had enabled it. Marcus told me Dante's therapist explained that religious authority abuse creates especially complex trauma because perpetrators weaponize faith and spiritual beliefs to maintain control and silence. Recovering requires untangling genuine spirituality from the manipulation tactics predators employ, which takes years of specialized therapy work. Several victims' families left organized religion entirely, unable to trust any religious institution after experiencing how completely their church had failed to protect children. Other families found new faith communities with robust safeguarding policies and transparent accountability structures. My family remained at Crosspoint through the leadership transition, but I stopped attending entirely, unable to feel safe in spaces that had enabled Sullivan's access to vulnerable boys. My parents accepted this boundary after everything, not pushing me to return to youth activities or worship services. The criminal case progressed over the following 18 months, with Sullivan pleading not guilty, despite overwhelming digital and testimonial evidence. His defense strategy focused on arguing that his interactions with boys had been misinterpreted pastoral care rather than abuse, and that physical contact had been appropriate athletic coaching rather than sexual assault. This approach required attacking victims' credibility and suggesting they'd fabricated or exaggerated experiences due to outside influence from investigators and therapists. Prosecutors prepared Dante and other victims for the trauma of testifying, but ultimately Sullivan accepted a plea agreement rather than forcing children through cross-examination. He pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts in exchange for a recommended sentence of 25 years in federal prison with lifetime supervised release and sex offender registration. The plea meant victims avoided testifying, but also meant some details of Sullivan's predatory pattern would never become public record, protecting the full scope of his crimes from complete exposure. I testified at Sullivan's sentencing hearing about the patterns I'd observed, my unsuccessful attempts to report concerns to adults who dismissed me, and Sullivan's deletion of evidence when I finally confronted him directly. The judge listened carefully and incorporated my testimony into her sentencing statement, noting that systematic failure of trusted adults to investigate credible warnings had allowed abuse to continue and escalate over months. She emphasized that religious institutions must prioritize child safety over reputation management, and that volunteers require rigorous screening regardless of their apparent dedication to ministry work. The judge imposed the maximum sentence within the plea agreement range: 30 years in federal prison with possibility of parole after 25, lifetime supervised release, permanent sex offender registration, and prohibition from any contact with minors outside supervised family contexts. Watching marshals lead Sullivan away in shackles brought complicated emotions. Relief that he couldn't access more victims mixed with anger about everything he'd destroyed through his calculated predatory behavior. Civil litigation followed quickly after criminal proceedings concluded, with multiple families suing Crosspoint Church for negligent hiring, failure to supervise volunteers, and inadequate safeguarding policies that enabled Sullivan's abuse. The church's insurance initially denied coverage, claiming intentional abuse wasn't covered under their policy, but eventually settled all claims for undisclosed amounts rather than face jury trials that would have generated damaging publicity. Settlement agreements required Crosspoint to implement comprehensive safeguarding reforms, including universal background checks for all volunteers, regardless of role, 2 adult rules for any activities involving minors, transparent reporting structures with external oversight, and annual training for everyone involved in youth ministry. The church also funded therapy for all basketball program participants, whether or not they'd disclosed abuse, recognizing that even witnessing aftermath created trauma, requiring professional support. Mrs. Zhang received recognition from the school district for her appropriate response to our disclosure and her advocacy throughout the investigation process. She told Marcus and me that our willingness to report despite massive pressure to stay silent had likely prevented years of additional abuse that would have continued if Sullivan hadn't been stopped. Her validation mattered because we both struggled with guilt about pain. The investigation caused our families and church community, even though intellectually we understood reporting was necessary. Therapy helped us recognize that any suffering from exposure of abuse was caused by the abuser and enablers, not by victims and witnesses who told the truth about dangerous patterns. That cognitive shift took months of processing to internalize, but eventually brought some peace. Marcus and I maintained our friendship through high school and college, bonded by shared experience most people couldn't fully comprehend. We both became involved in child advocacy work, speaking at churches and schools about recognizing grooming behaviors and the critical importance of listening when young people raise concerns about adults in authority positions. Our presentations emphasized that youth often notice predatory patterns before adults because they're directly experiencing inappropriate behavior rather than observing from comfortable distance. We taught adults to investigate concerning patterns seriously, rather than dismissing them as teenage drama or attention-seeking, highlighting how institutional loyalty blinds people to danger when they're overly invested in protecting organizational reputation. Some audiences received our message well, while others remained defensive, insisting false accusations were equally serious problems we should be equally concerned about preventing. Those defensive reactions always felt like missing the point, because proportionally, false reports are dramatically less common than actual abuse that goes unreported due to adults dismissing children's disclosures. The trauma of Sullivan's abuse and the systemic failure that enabled it remained present, but gradually became less defining as years passed and healing progressed. Dante recovered enough to play basketball in high school, reclaiming something Sullivan had tried to poison through his predatory behavior. Aiden completed trauma therapy and became a youth advocate himself, using his experience to help other survivors find their voices. Liam required ongoing support, but developed stronger boundaries and learned to recognize manipulation tactics disguised as helpfulness. They all carried permanent scars from what Sullivan had done and from how completely the church community had failed to protect them, but they refused to let that trauma become their only story. Finding purpose through advocacy work helped transform painful experiences into tools for preventing similar harm to other vulnerable children. Looking back now from several years' distance, the most painful realization is how many failure points had to align for Sullivan's abuse to continue as long as it did. Previous churches that covered up concerning behavior instead of reporting. The background check process that relied on self-attestation rather than independent verification. Church culture that discouraged questioning authority and framed scrutiny as divisive. Parents who trusted religious leaders more than their own children's observations. Senior pastors who prioritized avoiding scandal over investigating red flags. Each failure represented a missed opportunity to stop a predator, and the accumulation of those failures allowed him to harm dozens of boys across multiple years and locations. Understanding those systemic issues helped me move from feeling angry at individual adults toward advocating for policy changes that prevent similar failures in future. I eventually found a different faith community that took child protection seriously, with transparent policies and leadership that welcomed accountability rather than resenting oversight. Rebuilding trust in religious spaces took years because Sullivan had weaponized my spirituality against vulnerable children, making it difficult to separate authentic faith from manipulation tactics. Therapy helped me reclaim beliefs as my own, rather than contaminated by his abuse of religious authority. Not all victims achieved that separation, with several permanently leaving religious participation because the association remained too toxic. I respected their different outcomes while working toward my own healing. There's no single correct path through trauma recovery, especially abuse that exploits spiritual beliefs and community trust. The anniversary of Sullivan's arrest still brings difficult emotions each year. Memories and pain I've otherwise processed resurfacing with surprising intensity. On those hard days, I remind myself that reporting was the right choice, even though it temporarily cost me family relationships and community belonging. The children who were spared abuse because investigations stopped, Sullivan have no idea I exist, but their safety matters even in anonymity. Dante tells me similar things when his trauma resurfaces, that preventing others' suffering justifies the personal cost we paid for speaking up. We're not heroes for reporting concerning patterns we observed. We're just teenagers who refuse to participate in systemic silence that protects predators at children's expense. But sometimes refusing complicity is its own form of courage, especially when every adult demands that complicity in the name of community harmony or religious loyalty. That's the full story of how my report triggered an investigation that stopped a serial predator who'd been abusing boys across multiple churches for over a decade. There's no neat happy ending because trauma doesn't work that way, and healing isn't linear or complete. Victims are still processing what happened and will be for the rest of their lives. The church community remains divided about accountability and necessary reforms. My relationship with my parents improved, but never recovered the innocent trust that existed before they chose protecting church reputation over believing their son. Those ongoing consequences are part of what abuse does, fragmenting communities and relationships in ways that persist long after perpetrators go to prison. But children are safer now because the pattern got interrupted, and that matters more than the discomfort caused by exposing hidden abuse to necessary scrutiny and justice.